How's everybody doing tonight? Yeah. So, thank you guys for braving Hurricane Erica in advance, and Danny, which disappeared on us. So my name is Brian Breslin. I'm the founder of RefreshMiami. Peter Martinez, who's over there in the corner, is the co-director, and Josh, who is wandering around somewhere, he's our director of events. So I want to welcome you guys to RefreshMiami. This is the last part of our summer startup series. Tonight we're going to be talking about how engineering plays a role in growth. Sorry, someone was directing me from the back. Yeah, close the door. So tonight, so we started this series off 2 months ago. We had how do you ideate? How do you use design thinking to figure out your ideas and create and test your ideas? And then we talked about how do you fund your ideas? And tonight it's how do you grow your ideas? And so Alex has flown out all the way from California just to share with you guys all the insights and secrets he's learned over the years working at Dropbox, because we've all heard of Dropbox, right? Who here hasn't heard of Dropbox? No hands. Good. So you're all in the right place. All right. But I want to start off by thanking the Museum of Science, the Patricia and Philip Frost Museum of Science, because they've been our gracious hosts for so long. So let's give them a round of applause. So they're actually closing this building to the public next week on Sunday. So Sunday will be the last day that this building is open. But don't worry, they're building a much bigger, more magical, or scientifically fantastic building on Biscayne Boulevard, which will be open next spring or next summer. And in the meantime, this will be used to test out new ideas and things like that for next year. But we will be continuing our events in the fall, and we'll be doing a demo night in September, the last week of September. So if you've been working on your idea all summer, like you should have, after ideating and design thinking it, and then working on funding it and all that stuff and prototyping, then hopefully by September you have something that you want to show off and share with the world. And so we'll be opening up a forum next week on our website, on refreshmiami.com. So you can sign up and submit, and we'll be picking the probably 8 best companies that we think are cool, innovative, and haven't pitched at 8,000 other events, because we all want to see something new. And the winner will probably win some cash and prizes and stuff like that. And you guys are all welcome to come. It'll be most likely in downtown Miami. We'll try to make sure that it's accessible to everybody. And without further ado, I want to thank also our sponsors for tonight. So I want to thank Carve Communications, who was manning one of our topic towers, Accredify, which was also manning one of our topic towers, and also Ironhack. So Aaliyah from Ironhack is here. She's going to tell you guys a little bit about coding and how you can improve your lives through coding. And so let's give Ironhack and the other sponsors a round of applause.
I'm going to just keep it in.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Brian. So hi, my name is Aaliyah. I'm not going to take too much of your time. I know everyone wants to see Alex and his amazing mind come up here and talk about Dropbox, but how many of you have heard about Ironhack? Okay, it's not bad. How many of you love your job? Hey, that's what I like to hear. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to educate the next generation of digital builders. We have a 8-week intensive coding boot camp. We take people from all sorts of backgrounds. We've had former flight attendants. We've had world traveling yoginis. We've had people who've worked in the food service industry. We've had master's students from Cornell come and take our web development course. Within 8 weeks, our goal is to build a junior web developer who can get a job in the tech world, whether it's in Miami or elsewhere. So we will be here for the rest of the night. Ariel's here as well. Josh, our teaching assistant. So come say hi. We'd love to hear, if you're interested, or, come get a sticker. And and we'll hear from Alex next. Thank you.
So without further ado, I want to bring up Alex Yen, who flew all the way from San Francisco to join us. So let's give him a round of applause.
Okay. Am I clear? Can everybody hear my voice? Excellent. I'm hoping that these slides will show up. But before that happens, thanks so much, Peter and Brian, for giving me the opportunity to speak today. It's a real privilege. It's also my first time in Miami, so I'm pretty excited about that. Yeah, it's pretty amazing how small the tech community can be. The reason I got involved was one of my colleagues at Dropbox, Joel Flores, I think used to be involved with Refresh, moved to San Francisco, works on my team, and yeah, that's how we got in contact. Okay, fingers crossed that it stays that way. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about engineering growth. Yes? Oh, yeah, good call. Actually, do you want to do that real quickly? Awesome. That was really fast. Great. So we're going to talk about engineering growth. And the way that I'll be approaching it is talking about growth as an approach, and what are sort of the steps that I've taken or my team at Dropbox has taken to really enable growth various different ways across the company. But before that, a little bit about me, so you know my background and where I'm coming from. So I've been at Dropbox for over 3 years. I started off in like mid-2012 in San Francisco, and I was on a team called Business Operations, and one of the first projects I worked on was figuring out how to grow what would become our business product, Dropbox for Business. And it was mostly a self-serve business that we were trying to grow into a business that would also cater to mid-market and enterprise companies as we were moving towards the enterprise. But that was really what I was focused on when I first started off at Dropbox. About a year later, I actually moved to Dublin, Ireland. We were opening offices internationally. So in 2013, I think we opened Dublin and Sydney. And so I moved and was part of the landing team there. And I was still focused on growing Dropbox for Business, but it was a slightly different flavor. As I said, we were migrating towards the enterprise and hiring salespeople. And so the focus was not only the self-serve business, but also driving leads and ultimately opportunities for the sales team. So it was a slightly different approach and slightly different experience. At the end of 2014, I moved back to San Francisco, hence the bridge. And I actually now am on a team called Conversion Marketing, which I'll talk about what that means and what's our mandate. And my specific role on Conversion Marketing is to grow the subscription rate for Dropbox Pro. So Dropbox Pro is our premium product for consumers. It's a terabyte for $100 a year, something like that. And because it's a consumer product, a consumer premium product, it's also mainly a self-serve type of business. So yeah, this is my background. I'm going to talk I'm going to mention a few examples about some of the growth initiatives that Dropbox has done. A lot of them, some of them will predate me. And by the time I joined in 2012, Dropbox's user number was already like an 8-figure number. So it wasn't like there was already this. They already figured out how to grow the user number. But we were trying to figure out how to grow the business product, and there were some other things we were trying to figure out as well. Cool. So before I dive into it, I wanted to put some helpful thoughts about growth that some of you might just say are pretty obvious or are truisms. but I think they are worth reiterating. And for those, like seeing them the first time, hopefully they're helpful. So we'll go into them in greater detail. So one, build a great product first. I don't think growth to me is something you do when you have a great product that you can grow. How do you know if you have a great product? That's a really hard question to answer. I don't have the answer to that question. I think a lot of people will have different answers to that question. But maybe a good way to think about it is if you have organic growth, which is what I consider the best form of growth. It's zero acquisition cost. It's the best indicator that I think users or customers are engaging with your product and actually like it to the point that they might actually want others to use that product as well. Growth is an approach, not a set of tools. So I think sometimes when people think about growth initiatives, they think about, okay, I got to figure out AdWords, I got to figure out SEO, I've got to figure out content marketing and email and marketing automation and so forth. And that's partially true, but it's not a set of it's not a checklist of things that you just need to figure out. It's really about an approach and what that, and we'll talk more about what the approach is. But I think that's important to iterate, to mention, sorry. Thinking in first principles. So, what worked for Dropbox might not work for you, right? What worked for Slack or for other, rapidly growing companies is maybe unique to Slack. And I think it's important always to think in first principles, to think about why, a certain growth effort is going to work. You can juxtapose this with best practices, where a best practice is something like, hey, I saw company X do this thing and it worked for company X, so it might work for me. That's a good starting point, but I don't think that it's sufficient. Like if you don't have the why it worked for company X, then how are you supposed to know it's going to work for you as well? So I think it's important to think about first principles when you're doing growth. Be hypothesis driven. I don't think growth is, throwing a bunch of stuff on the wall and seeing what sticks, right? It's not, hey, I want to test 20 different button colors and to see which button color everyone likes the most. I think there's a little more thought into what you'd want to test. And there's some other reasons why you would want to be hypothesis driven. But that's the main one is, think about what your user wants, right? And how your user might benefit from this improvement or this change. And I think that's a really good way to think about experimentation. Worth mentioning again, there are no silver bullets. There actually might be silver bullets for your product or your company, and they're different from other products and other companies. And maybe they'll be uncovered by the discovery process through growth. But there isn't. Everybody has sort of a different path, it seems. Cool. So I'll briefly talk to. So I mentioned sort of what we're going to talk about today here. There's sort of 6 things. So just what are the basics? What does a growth team and culture look like? And then what is the quote unquote approach that I talked about? So the way I think about it is you have ideas. How do you assess them? Okay, once you do that, how do you actually set up experiments and initiatives to grow things? Why it's important to follow up with those efforts, and we'll talk about this one a lot. And then some other things that I've learned that I couldn't bucket into the first 5. So the basics. So if you're thinking about, doing growth initiatives at your company, I think it's important to have a foundation of tools and skills and a framework that enables you to do growth thoughtfully. And so here are kind of 4 things that I think are pretty important, right? Instrumentation. So what tools and frameworks are you using, right? Are you logging data in a way that actually allows you to get insights that drive growth experiments, right? Do you have an A/B testing framework? Do you have A/B testing tools, right? If you're going to run a lot of experiments or a lot of growth initiatives, even something like a task management, like a Jira or a Fabricator or something like that could be helpful. Maybe you are thin on engineering resources, and maybe a CMS would help. Like, what are the tools or frameworks you're using? Two, metrics. What are you growing and why? And I think it's important to be very specific here. I don't think it's just, hey, I want to increase the number of users or I want to increase revenue, but really define the type of metric that you want to grow, right? Let's take like Slack, for example, which is a chat app, right? Oftentimes analysts will evaluate companies by their monthly active user number, but Slack is a chat app. People who use Slack actively don't chat once a month. They're probably chatting once a day or chatting several times a day. So really, wouldn't daily active users be a more accurate measurement? If you're a B2B business, right, maybe your goal shouldn't be purchases, it should be trials, or it should be leads, or qualified leads, right? Figuring out what is the appropriate metric that you want to grow. Mapping out the data. So let's say you have your instrumentation, you've logged stuff, you know how your site is performing or your app is performing, and what are some of the activities that you want that user to do, and what those numbers are. Like, it's important to map it out. I have here sort of a picture of a funnel. So the example I can use is if you have a product on the web, right? What does your web funnel look like? What traffic are you getting? How does that traffic convert to signups, to users, to monetization, et cetera? Actually figuring out the funnel is important. And that probably seems obvious, but it's important to figure this out because it's going to help drive a lot of the growth ideas that you might have. A growth model, I think it's, I sort of put a picture of, well, it's kind of a sync icon, but really thinking of growth as like a flywheel, right? So what in your sort of growth model exists? Is there like stickiness or virality? We can use actually a Dropbox example for this. So I think a lot of people are aware of the referral model for Dropbox, right? Someone gives you invites you to a shared folder. Now you signed up, and all of a sudden a bunch of users are on Dropbox. That's actually only half of it. The referral model gets users through the door, but there needs to be something that keeps them there. And for Dropbox, it was about getting started. So Dropbox.com/getting started, or is it /GS, was a series of actions that you had to do to earn more space. And the reason why those actions existed is because those actions actually correlated well with long-term user engagement, right? So it was not just about using referrals to get people into Dropbox, but also figuring out how you can keep them engaged, and at some point they would do referrals of their own. So figuring out what that growth model looks like. So this is a really busy slide. It's just an image. And it's regarding the instrumentation point I made earlier. This is actually a really cool resource called the Growthverse. It like lists every single, it's probably not that like entirely comprehensive, but it covers a lot, right, of the quote unquote marketing stack, or every tool you might need to build a growth engineering system. And the reason I put this here is that there are a lot of things out there, right? And it's not about accumulating this like huge set of tools. It's figuring out like which are the things you're going to use that will allow you to do the growth initiatives you want to do. At Dropbox, for example, we actually have a number of tools that we've built in-house that, instead of using a third-party tool, we just said, hey, we're going to build like our own A/B testing framework. And the reason we did that is because one of the objectives for us was being able to conduct some pretty tricky experiments that we felt would be difficult to enable with a third-party tool. Like, you couldn't just drop a pixel on a bunch of different pages to make this experiment work. So we really took some of these tools in-house. But I think it's important to just sort of figure out, okay, if I'm going to do some growth initiatives, like what are those things I need, and then what are the tools that help me get there? And are those tools allowing me to do 50% of the ideas that I want to do, 100%, or not? As I mentioned, getting started was, the other part of that equation for the growth model. It wasn't just about, shared folder invites that triggered referral signups. It was also about finding ways to keep those users there once they signed up. Okay, so growth team and culture. So I sort of talked about kind of the basics, right? So if you have the infrastructure and the tools to do some growth initiatives, you have an idea of what you're trying to grow and how to measure it. You have kind of the foundation to start doing some growthy stuff. What does a growth team and growth culture look like? So 5 points here. So growth as a company mindset. I think it's important to have like a culture of growth in the company, an openness to an experimentation, an openness around data, an openness around, what are some of the things we want to test to improve the user experience and hopefully result in, increases in signups or monetization or so forth. So I think it's important to have growth as a company mindset because, and I'm sure all of you know this, you're working on your startup, you're working for a company, and there's probably not a shortage of things to do. And it's figuring out, what do I want to prioritize, right? Like, you could spend all your time growing stuff, or maybe you want to spend some of your time actually building new product or doing, figuring out some other sort of go-to-market approach for your business. So having an understanding of, okay, like, as a company, we want to focus on growth, and this is like the extent to which we want to focus on it. Who should focus on and drive growth? Well, I mean, everyone should have, I think, some perspective on growth. So I went through a growth meetup recently in SF. It was like a couple months ago, and they actually surveyed all the people who attended. And it's actually an interesting mix of people. Some companies, growth actually sits under the product organization. Some companies, it sits under the marketing organization. So my official role at Dropbox is conversion marketing. So the part of growth that I play a role in is very marketing intensive, and so I sit in the marketing org. But it really varies for each company, right? And it varies based on your product complexity. But there should be probably some clear DRIs, or directly responsible individuals, for growth, right? Like, here are the people who are overseeing all the different growth initiatives across the company. What does a growth team look like? I guess at a high level, a growth team consists of, somebody who is managing growth initiatives. They could be a product manager, a growth marketer. There's usually a team of developers. They can be web developers or full stack if you end up having to do some back-end stuff as well to enable your growth efforts. Designer helps. And then if you are also trying some other initiatives like, paid search or stuff like that, of course, specialists who can focus on page search or other sort of digital marketing levers. So it's a pretty cross-functional effort. Having somebody who's really good at analytics is helpful, and somebody who's really good at user insights, right, which may also, or user experience, which also may be your design person. So your growth team might have people who wear multiple hats, but those are all the different functions you need. Clear goals and metrics, last thing I'll say, and then I'll move on. So a couple slides ago, I talked about, having an idea of what metrics you want to grow, whether that be users or whether that be, annualized recurring revenue if you're a B2B SaaS business, right? It's also important to have these clear metrics because then it's easy for the company to rally behind them, right? It's nice to have this sort of like, this one number that everyone sort of understands and follows, right? Like, I guess the cliche is if you watch The Social Network and they have that monitor with, the incrementing user number, right? That's, I guess, a pretty obvious one, but it's something that rallies the company and gets people excited, and also helps them understand, like, this is what we're like trying to chase here. Okay, so you have, let's say you have a growth team, you have, or a subset of your company is now focused on doing growthy things. What does that actually mean? Here's what I think assessing growth ideas is about. So first, it's like figuring out what opportunities there are to grow. Is it whether it's users or whether it's recurring revenue? Figuring out what those opportunities are. But where do you start? How do you know what experiments to run or what initiatives to do? That's where the growth model and the funnel, the thing that you mapped earlier, helps. Because if you have an idea of, okay, I can start from traffic to signups to users to monetization, then you now know, okay, well, what's the conversion rate for each? Well, if I have X visitors, what percentage of X visitors are signing up, and so forth, and actually identify where those drop-offs are. And maybe those drop-offs are where you should improve things, and that's where your growth opportunities are. The growth model itself, right? If in the Dropbox case, we had figured out the shared folder referrals, but not necessarily what to do after that to keep users engaged, that would be the growth initiative. I think another way to think about it are thinking about growth opportunities in terms of segments, right? So let's say you have a set of users or a set of customers. All of your customers or users probably don't look the same, right? They might be from different geographies. They might have signed up or onboarded to your product differently. So are there specific segments that are underperforming or not doing as well as the others? And is that an opportunity to grow? And so if you've actually mapped out your funnel and mapped out figured out your growth model, then there should be these obvious opportunities where you can figure out where things could be improved, and those represent growth opportunities. So let's say you've now figured out what those growth opportunities are. What is that? What do you do next? Let's say, okay, I see a huge drop-off from users who sign up and then become active users over 30 days, right? How do I improve that? Then you start brainstorming ideas, right? And maybe those ideas are around, improving. Let's say there's this, one product feature that you want them to use more, or you want them to, they come to a landing page and click on this button or something like that more, right? But what do you do to get them to do that? Yeah, that's where the brainstorming comes in. That's where you need to really start thinking about a bunch of different ideas to enable you to do that action, right? So I'll get into a more specific example, but you want to come up with a bunch of different variants to test, and then you want to choose specific variants to experiment with. Having a design team here is really helpful because they're really creative and they come up with some really interesting ideas for you to test. So I'll get into a specific example here. But yeah, let's talk about some user segments first. So one that's really obvious for Dropbox was international growth. There's no one continent that represents a majority of users at Dropbox anymore, right? So we used to have, North America does not have 50% of Dropbox users. It's less than that. And when you start diving into the data, you realize, well, in this continent, you might have lower monetization, right? Or lower lower number of active users. And if you look further into that, you realize, well, why are those users monetizing at a lower rate? How do I grow that monetization rate, right? What are the things that I can do to improve that? And those were representing growth opportunities for us, figuring out, okay, well, in Europe, there might be certain countries that underperform the US in terms of signups to active users to purchase. And then you can then say, well, in those specific countries, I want to run experiments to see if I can increase those conversion rates, right? If the conversion rate from active users to purchase is lower for those specific countries, are there experiments I could run on the purchase flow to increase that rate, so users in those countries will better understand what Dropbox is and pay for it. So that's one sort of segment. Another segment that we commonly look at is what type of user you are based on the type of devices you use, right? So people sign up for Dropbox in a bunch of different ways. There's a lot of users who get onboarded to Dropbox because they bought a Samsung phone, and we have a deal with Samsung where you can get some space with Dropbox. And so their experience is mobile first, or a very common way is on the desktop. Actually, there's two ways on the desktop, right? You can sign up on the internet or sign up by downloading the Dropbox desktop client. And so each of those are different channels or other different ways to cut the data. And so then it's figuring out how do you, if this particular channel, for example, if mobile onboarded users are creating fewer long-term active users than the other channels, is that an opportunity to grow here? To figure out, well, maybe I need to fix the mobile onboarding experience. Or, on the desktop, maybe there's, versus the web, there's something there, right? So those are just different ways to identify opportunities for experiments by just focusing on specific segments. Again, having designers helps. Designers can come up with really creative ideas to help you figure out what you want to test. I can give one example. So I'm focused right now on Dropbox Pro, right? And so the goal is to get existing users of Dropbox to who hopefully use a product and love it to be also willing to pay for more space because they might benefit from it. There's, usually the upgrade flow is you're on Dropbox. At some point, you click Upgrade Account, and then that takes you to a landing page about Dropbox Pro, and then you click a purchase page, and then you purchase, right? But we struggled a lot with, well, is the purchase page, designed in a way that enables people to pay? Are we introducing unnecessary friction in that purchase page? And if so, what are the things we can do to eliminate that friction and increase that conversion rate from users who land on that page to users who purchase that page, right? And that's where, someone on your design team or somebody who has some user insights or your user experience background could come up with a bunch of different ideas and say, maybe they're confused by this field. Maybe they're confused by this particular set of radio buttons. And that would then help inform some of the experiments you want to test. And so that's just one example. Okay, so let's say now you have like a list of growth ideas and you want to test them all, but you really shouldn't. You should just test a few of them, and you should really test the ones that matter the most. So it's important to estimate the impact of your experiments beforehand. So what does that mean? So let's say I have, let's take the Dropbox Pro example. You have a page, and users who land on that page, who are Dropbox users, learn about Dropbox Pro, and if they're interested in buying, they click to the purchase page and purchase, right? And so I want to increase that. And there's a bunch of different experiments I want to run. But I should probably first, before I run those experiments, figure out what the impact is, potential impact is of all the different experiments I want to run. Why is that important? It helps you prioritize. You should probably focus on the experiments that could deliver the most impact first. 2, it helps you calibrate and build intuition, and we'll talk about this a little bit later. And 3, it's actually, you should, if you don't do this, you actually kind of risk statistical bias, actually. You risk a lot of type 2 errors if you just run an experiment and say, oh, wait, I've now reached some level of statistical significance, let's go. So you want to estimate impact. That's really hard. You might say, well, how do I know if this experiment's going to increase my conversion rate by like a certain percentage or not? Honestly, most people, I think, to start off, they just guess. They guess, and if they, that's why it's important to follow. And I'll mention this later, to follow up, because once they guess, and if they're right or wrong, that helps them calibrate and build intuition, and it helps them understand, okay, here are the experiments that worked and why, and here was kind of the uplift I saw from them. Qualitative insights also help. So one thing that also helps before running an experiment is maybe trying to spend some time to understand the why an experiment might work. User research was a big thing for Dropbox. It's a big, if you actually look at some of the interviews that like Drew has had earlier with Dropbox, user research was a big reason why I think Dropbox worked. Is we spent a lot of time answering the why we thought this particular onboarding experience was good. If you've estimated your impact, then you can prioritize and focus on the experiments that matter most. You should do this because time, resources, and user delight is finite, right? You can't run 1 million experiments. You just don't have the sample sizes to run 1 million experiments. You don't have engineers. You don't have like an infinite amount of engineering time to build these experiments too. So you should really just focus on the ones you think are going to have the most impact. And then user delight is finite. I think from the user perspective, you can't just run a bunch of experiments and then when a user is looking at your product every day, it's different. That just disrupts his or her experience, right? They only have so much tolerance for things you want to test. I think for Dropbox, that's very important. And the corollary of that is know your speed limit. There are certain parts of Dropbox that we will test a lot more than others. For example, we can't really disrupt the core experience with Dropbox, right? That's something that we've built over years. We've built user trust over the years, and so, you know, there are certain parts of the Dropbox product we won't actually experiment with as much. But let's say a landing page for Dropbox Pro, where users are learning about Pro, and it's, you know, Dropbox's responsibility to figure out how we communicate that product to them. That's probably something where we have a little more leeway. We can really figure out what's the right message, what's the right thing we want to communicate to those users. So really figuring out which surface areas of the product you can actually, like to what extent you can experiment on them. So this is an obvious slide that refers to the estimating impact and avoiding statistical bias. Like you want to make sure that if you're running experiments that, you know, there's a level of rigor around them, that you don't run an experiment and the data looks good and then you just ship it all of a sudden, right? There needs to be this methodology to it. That methodology varies from company to company. I think some of the peers that I've heard have a much lower threshold for statistical significance than others. And really that's really a preference that you need to make as a company, right? If you're, on the one hand you could say, hey, look, I only want to ship experiments that I think really matter and I'm confident they will definitely work, and your threshold is really high and most of your experiments probably won't work, but that's fine. The ones that do, that you'll feel very confident that they work. Others are a little more, I guess, risk-taking in their approach. So you've now identified what experiments you want to run because you've estimated the impact and you've prioritized them. So what does it mean to set it up? So first, you should probably assess, can you actually build this experiment, right? Do you have the tools to do it? If not, do you have the engineering resources to do it? Can they do it quickly? Do you have the data logging set up in a way that allows you to get the insights you need quickly? That factors into your sort of cost-benefit analysis of experimentation, right? Because it's not just about the benefit, it's also about the cost. It's about the time you need to spend to make this experiment work. So feasibility assessment, is this like, you know, an experiment that can be built really quickly? Two, what's the plan? So how is this experiment actually going to play out? So as I mentioned before, it's important to estimate the impact beforehand to avoid all these like biases in the data and to really know what you're doing. You want to determine the experiment beforehand, the parameters. So by parameters, I mean, I'm going to run this experiment for this long. I'm going to, you know, define success by these metrics, and I want these metrics to have, you know, this much uplift, or I hope to get this much uplift from my experiments. And that should be like things you set way before the experiment is run. And then you run the experiment, and then you see how the data actually plays out. It's not about, hey, I'm going to run an experiment, and oh, the data starts looking really good, so let's just go forward with that. I think that you risk a lot of bias with that. Monitoring performance, that's actually monitoring the data and making sure that nothing crazy happens, right? You might run an experiment that actually has really bad outcomes for, you know, your conversion rate or for the specific metric you're evaluating. One practice that I've noticed a lot is this idea of ramping, right? So when you start an experiment, you don't expose the experiment to 100% of your users. Because if it doesn't work out, you actually could risk damaging a lot of, or really ruining the experience for a lot of users. So what you might do is you start with like 1% of users, and then you ramp up to like 5%. I know at Facebook, the common story they talk about is like Facebook will start experiments in Canada or in Australia, right? Because there aren't as many users in Canada or Australia as there are in the United States. And if it works out, well, then they'll try to find a way to make it work in the US. But there is, you know, this active process of sort of monitoring the experiment. And then once you run your experiment, you've got your data, you analyze and you say, okay, well, I saw X% uplift in my conversion rate from people who landed to this page and made a purchase, or I saw, X% improvement from people who wanted to click this button and do this use this particular product feature. And then finding a way to actually tie that impact to the broader metrics, if you have them, or to actually just estimate what this means for, growth improvement for your product or your company. And I think it's also helpful to compare to other experiments to sort of figure out, oh, this experiment worked well, this one experiment didn't work well. It's all about building intuition again and really calibrating. Okay, so we're almost at the end of this sort of process or this approach. So it's really important to follow up with every experiment and really do this like post-mortem or really deep analysis of why an experiment worked or didn't work. Why is this important? So building intuition is a big thing, right? The results of your past experiments should help you figure out what are the right next experiments to run or not run, and also prioritize experiment ideas that you have. As I mentioned first, like when you start experiments, you might have to guess what you think the potential impact could be. Hey, I want to change the way the layout of this page works so that there's a 5% lift in conversion rate. Well, you don't know if it's going to be 5. And you probably will never be able to guess with perfect accuracy, but the more you do it and the more you go and say, hey, this is what the actual percentage uplift was compared to what I thought it was, you'll build this intuition for what types of growth activities will actually, work and to what extent. So really building this intuition is important, and that's really this like flywheel process with growth experimentation, right? You run some experiments, they work or they don't work. The ones that work help inform the next set of experiments you want to run and also inform your estimation of how well they'll run. The misses matter just as much as the wins. They tell you what doesn't work also, right? A common example is we will run copy experiments on a landing page. So there's a landing page for Dropbox Pro, and it talks about Dropbox Pro, right? And we'll test different versions of copy. Some will be more serious, some will be more playful, some will talk about features, some will talk about benefits, right? The insights from those experiments can inform so much more than just your web properties or that particular experiment, right? You can take that copy and say, hey, sales, maybe your pitch should slightly be different. Hey, content team, maybe what you put on the blog should be written differently, right? Hey, same thing with emails, same thing with other parts of the product. So the wins or the misses are both insightful. It's another form of data that you can use to really figure out, what your users want, and what keeps them engaged. This was just a slide to show how this, there's implications from your experiments for sales, for content, for other marketing teams, for product, and so forth. So other reasons why it's important to follow up. There's this idea like, if you run an experiment and it doesn't work, is it because the hypothesis is wrong? Who knows, right? It could be because the experiment was not the right one. Maybe the specific variant you were testing just didn't work. That doesn't necessarily mean the hypothesis was wrong. There's this element of persistence sometimes that you just have to have with certain experiments. Here's an example. So, one user segment that I think about a lot at Dropbox is users who run out of space and are what we call over quota. So they sign up for Dropbox, they got their 2 gigs, maybe they got some more space later on, they've run out of space. They're very interesting to us because they clearly use Dropbox a lot and they use it enough to run out of space. How can we build a better experience for them? And there's this hypothesis that, hey, we should be emphasizing certain things about Dropbox Pro that cater to them more than they would cater to the average user. And we tried a lot of experiments, and the early ones all failed. But I don't think I still felt like the hypothesis was true because we did some user research, and there is some clear, some clear signal that users who ran out of space had a very different idea of what Dropbox could bring for them. I mean, they knew that they could pay for more space, so could we emphasize that? And so we ran more experiments and actually got something to work there. Again, qualitative insights, right? Your experiments will tell you that things worked or didn't work. They won't tell you why. And again, it's important to run user research or interviews or user studies to really understand why a user reacted this way or that way. So many times you'll come across something where you thought a user looked at a page and you thought they would think about this page a certain way, and they just did not resonate with them at all. The last thing, just some other things that I've learned about growth experimentation and really just sort of growth process that I think are worth sharing that I guess couldn't fit into the others. So one, be patient and open to surprises. I think if you're running experiments, like most people I've noticed that I've spoken to in the growth community, a lot of your experiments will not work, right? Like don't expect your experiment hit rate to be the same as like, an NBA player's free throw percentage. It's not going to be that. It's going to be way lower. So be patient, be open to surprises. There's so many experiments I've run that I felt were obvious and they weren't, like the results didn't work out, or others that were sort of less excited about the potential and they just outperforms what I expected. 2, experimenting is not shipping. This is big. You might run experiments and you might get some insights from those experiments. It doesn't necessarily mean you want to, change that. If let's say you're experimenting on like a website or a particular interface for your app, and you run an experiment, the data looks better. That doesn't necessarily mean you want to ship it. You might want to spend some time doing some user research and figuring out why. Because again, the reason the results might be doing better is not the reason you think it is, right? Maybe people are clicking on that button because they actually don't understand it, not because you think that you're communicating a better message, right? And so really understanding the experiment before you ship is important. This is something I struggle with a lot, local or global maximum. So if you think about experimentation, right? Like let's say you run an experiment on a page and you run a series of experiments and you're showing some incremental gains. But what happens if all you're doing is like approaching this local maximum? Like the page, the way it looks and the experiment you run, you will get only a 10% lift at best. But if you tried something completely different, you'd get a 20% conversion rate versus 10%, right? But you're running all these experiments on this 10% base, so the best thing you're gonna do is hit this 10% sort of asymptote, right? So that's sort of the thing I struggle with a lot is local or global maximum. I think a good way to address this is every so often I think it's just fun to try something completely different, try something outrageous and see how that performs. And if it does actually change the numbers drastically, then maybe you are actually at the local and maybe there is a global maximum out there. Goals and metrics can evolve over time. I think that's very obvious for Dropbox, right? Early on, Dropbox was about getting users and getting users to be active. But now that there's Dropbox and Dropbox Pro and Dropbox for Business, there's a lot of different quote unquote approaches to growth, right? You can grow the number of users. You could also grow the number of business users. You can grow the number of paid subscriptions and so forth. So goals and metrics can evolve over time. They can also have trade-offs. So one common thing that I think a lot about with my team is, if a user is interested in paying for Dropbox, are they paying for Dropbox Pro, which is the premium product for consumers, or are they really interested in buying Dropbox for their business, which is Dropbox for Business, right? And sometimes you might be running an experiment that might involve both Dropbox for Business and Dropbox Pro, right? And figuring out, that experiment might benefit Dropbox for Business at the risk of Dropbox Pro or vice versa. And that's sort of a trade-off or a decision you have to make. Same thing, a common trade-off is, do you want to sacrifice user growth for monetization, right? Or vice versa. Accelerating the customer journey. So the other thing that I think is important to think about when you run experiments is, if you're looking for a certain uplift in a certain action, right? The conversion rate on this page increases, or I want a user to click this button and then use this feature a lot more by a certain percentage. It's also important to know over what time frame that experiment is being applied, right? So another example is with Dropbox Pro, right? So when we run experiments on the landing page for Dropbox Pro, where we want people to pay for Dropbox, we might run experiments and we might see an initial uplift in the conversion rate. So maybe we run an experiment and all of a sudden those users who see the new variant are buying Dropbox Pro and and compared to the control, they're buying it at a higher rate, and all of a sudden the data looks good. But maybe all we're doing is getting them to pay faster, and maybe a month from now they would have paid for Dropbox Pro anyways, right? And that's accelerating the customer journey. Like you're not actually increasing the long-term subscription rate or the long-term conversion rate. You're just making it sort of get there faster. That's just something to think about as well. That's not necessarily a bad thing either, but it's just the impact is slightly different. So that's all I really had. Thanks for. Oh yeah, sure. Yeah.
The water, sorry about that. I just had a question because I noticed you were mentioning a lot of the user interface. So I just want to know on the conversion rate, regards to your experience and also the consumer insights, what do you think increases the most the conversion rate? The UI, the UX, or any updates on the capabilities?
So the question was on what I think increases the conversion rate the most: UI, UX, or is it new capabilities, user capabilities? It's unfortunately I think the answer is it depends. I think we've seen we've seen each of the three have sort of its role. I think sometimes the framework I think about is, are you running these incremental experiments when you should really be running these like big moonshot like changes, right? Like, so that would be like a complete rehaul of like your UX or something like that. There is really, I don't really think there's a real answer to either, because what I've seen people do these moonshot ideas and they've worked. Similarly, like, in the process of figuring out these incremental experiments, there was then an idea that became like a huge change of its own. Yeah, I don't know. Sorry, I can't get a better answer for you, but I don't think there's like a canonical, like one change that's better. Sorry, I actually back there. Yeah.
Me? Yeah. Okay. So you were saying how there's a thing that you found super confusing was the difference between local growth and like global maximum.
Yep.
And my question is, can you really determine that there truly is a global maximum, considering at a certain point people just like change, just making a change to your UI? Say you have like the most optimum UI and you keep it for 10 years, and then
Yep.
it changes. Is there really truly a global maximum?
Yeah, so the question is there really truly a global maximum? My sense is no. I mean, you're right. Over time, user behaviors change, and what might be a quote unquote global maximum or something that's really good now could be different later, due to some things such as like user fatigue, or maybe the product itself has evolved to a point where that existing UI is kind of confusing. But I think I guess what I was trying to say there was there's always this sort of like continuous search for improvement, because the thing is you don't really know, right? So if you don't really know, I guess the optimist in you can say there's maybe a global maximum out there that's still worth seeking. But that again also comes down to like I think prioritization and figuring out, well, I think this conversion rate is pretty high. Should I be spending all this time and resources trying to increase it, or are there some other things I should be doing with like developer time or with design time or with my time?
Then is it good to actually have global maximum as like something that you search? Like, should you just not have that as part of your ideology? Like, say you always want to improve it, but why should you have the vocabulary that there is a global maximum? Why should you try why should you try to settle with something? Why should you see, hey, I think this is global maximum, I'm gonna settle with this? Shouldn't you just say, hey, this is what we have at the moment, we'll come back and try to improve it later? Why even have that? Why even have that as part of your vocabulary?
That's a fair point. I think it's more about like when I think about like growth efforts. nomenclature notwithstanding, to me it's about like aspiring to try to improve the existing like rate or existing conversion rate of something. And unless it's 100%, you know, I'd like to think there is room for improvement. And then there might not be, right? That's like, who really knows? Part of the experimentation process is to understand whether there is, you know, opportunity to grow, right? Like early on, if you're running experiments and you're seeing like 10, 20% lifts, then you're probably way far away from there. But if, you know, to borrow a cliche, you've run out of like low-hanging fruit to pick, maybe then you like move on. But yeah, I mean, like global maximum technically might be like, you know, a fool's errand. I think you back there. Oh yeah, actually, because I remember seeing you raise your hand a while ago. Yeah.
So the getting started page.
Yeah.
Do you know, or do you have any insight as to what the psychology is of the user when they go through that? Are they being type A personality and they just want to get through the checkboxes, or do they really want to know the features? And then just a little bit of a follow-up to that.
Yeah.
Do you think it's better upfront for acquiring users or on an as-needed basis when they're already in the site using features?
Yeah. So to answer your first question, which was around getting started, was it really, you know, what was the underlying psychology? Was it, hey, I want to get as many boxes checked, or I actually want to discover the features? That one's hard to tell. Like, I think it's a little bit of both. Another, you know, one of the other sort of growth initiatives we did was this thing called Dropquest, where you could get more space by like figuring out all these different sort of actions. And I think the motivation for Dropquest was probably, hey, I need to do these things to get the space, so it's more like checking the boxes. But I think maybe the hope is when you do that, you come across some delight or something that you're like, oh, I didn't realize I could do that. And that's actually going to change my workflow. Your second question was around
Having the on-demand, when like they're discovering a new feature, just having information about that versus all those 12 things.
Yeah. So his question was around like having something on demand versus like, you know, an on-demand description of the feature versus, you know, a long list of things you can do. Yeah, my sense is, I think the on-demand works in a situation where the user is really looking for like the solution to that particular need at that time. What I think what I've seen like not work is like, hey, let me just surface this modal and like introduce something to you, and then mostly it's just like dismiss. And that's where like the list is, I guess, to some extent helpful because it actually shows like the range of possibilities. But for us, like for Dropbox, you know, if there's a certain like feature that we've introduced, like the greatest adoption has always been when like someone was specifically looking for that feature, which was evidenced by, hey, I'm actually trying to like click around and find if I can do this thing, like add a password to this like shared link file. That helps it. Yes. Oh.
Thanks for making the trip and sharing the knowledge.
Oh.
I've got
Welcome.
two quick questions.
Sure.
The first one is there a specific book on the topic that you would recommend? And second is, we're looking to hire a great growth hacker. Where's a good place to look?
Yeah, so books that I think have been really useful, or resources, and then where it's like a good place, I guess, for hiring. So the first, I can share with you the things that I've read that I found like quite helpful. I would say on the B2B side, I'll start there first because that's where I was sort of started at Dropbox. There is a book, I think it's called Predictable Revenue. I think it's by Aaron Ross. He was an ex-Salesforce guy. And the title of the book is like How to Go from like 0 to 100 million annualized recurring revenue. I thought that was really thoughtfully put together. Another guy, this is not like a book, but a person whose insights I really admire is Jason Lemkin. So he was the founder of Adobe EchoSign, which I think is now like called Adobe Document something Cloud. but he actually has a really good Quora presence, and he answers all these questions about like B2B growth that I think are just like really thoughtful. Like he had this the one that really stuck with me is someone asked him about what are all the different ways you can acquire business customers. And which ones work the best and which not. And he was like, well, actually, you should be thinking about it in terms of the what is the actual price you charge per user, because that actually dictates whether some things are like gonna actually be worth spending for or not, right? So if you're only charging customers $100 a year, maybe you don't want to do a huge trade show where all you're gonna get is like one customer, right? So those resources were good. I don't know if you've heard of Moe's. They have a book I think it's called Inbound Marketing and SEO. It's like kind of a thickish textbook, but it's a pretty good resource. On the consumer side, Andrew Chen has a pretty good blog. And I think Andy Johns, I don't know if he has a blog, but he has a pretty good presence on Quora too, and he was a pretty good, he's done growth at a lot of companies where there was great growth, like Facebook and Twitter and Quora itself. And the last one, growthhackers.com actually is a pretty good resource. It's basically a community of other growth marketers. Presumably many of them are employed, but you never know. Yes. Oh, yeah.
So for a B2B product that's targeting companies 50 plus.
Like 50 employees plus.
50 employees.
Okay, yeah.
As far as trying to think that will convert online versus via actually talking to a person.
Yeah.
I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on
Yeah.
that. I guess it depends to some degree if the company's established or
Right.
not well known already.
Right. So we actually struggle with this a lot. I mean, ideally, the best type of business is a self-serve business where people just go and say, "Hey, I think what you're doing is cool. Take my money." But at a certain scale, I think what you start realizing is you hit these processes that need to be addressed, these concerns that the company has that need to be addressed. And that I think varies for each company size. So for Dropbox, I can tell you what mattered was at a certain company size, we realized that there wasn't one person who could actually just purchase Dropbox for Business for the company. They actually had to get IT's approval, and then there was a purchase manager. And I think once, it really was just a matter of data when we started realizing, okay, all of these self-serve deals, we're not above a certain number. And so at this number, this is probably the threshold where the call to action should be a lead and not forcing them through a trial flow. And that was really just something that we sort of discovered. I think early on, we actually, on the Dropbox for Business page, allowed you to start a trial for up to 500 users. But there wasn't 500 person companies coming in and saying, "Oh yeah, I want to buy this right now. Take all my money, and I'm going to set it up." Once we actually saw the sizes of the companies coming in, there was just this threshold where we were like, "Okay, well, clearly at this point, a conversation needs to be had." So, yeah. Oh, you and then you. Sorry. Yeah.
When you say the most lots of experiments failed, are you saying that you weren't able to improve upon the control, or that you weren't able to collect the data that you need to make a decision? And then that kind of leads me to the second question: what is your threshold for enough data to make a decision? I know you said that it varies from organization to organization, but what's yours? And do you consider yourself to be conservative or aggressive?
Yeah. So to answer your first question, the first question was around, a lot of experiments don't work, and is it because a shortage of data or a shortage of, or just you didn't see better performance versus the control? Thankfully, it's more the former. The former that I said was data. So more the latter, where we just didn't see the uplift that we thought. And that's the importance of actually setting up, really planning out the experiment and saying, okay, this is how I'm going to get the data. Because you're right. You're not going to use. You're going to be wasting your time a little bit if you have this experiment idea and you're still, as you're setting up the experiment, trying to figure out how you get the right data. So we just tried a lot of things that didn't work, and that's fine. We actually learned from those things as well. Your second question was around. Sorry, it was.
How much data do you
Oh yeah. So if I were to be specific, like, like most statistical analyses, they ask for like 95% significance and 10% power, right? That's like kind of the, for what it's worth, like academic threshold. I've heard companies go as low as 80. I'd say that we at Dropbox tend to actually lean more towards kind of the higher threshold, because at this point, like, with our user base, we just don't want to do so many things that are disruptive, so the burden of proof is higher. But once you like figured out, okay, I want like this significance level and this statistical power level, and I expect this uplift, that actually determines how many, what's your sample size for that experiment, right? Like there's a lot of like online calculators you can just enter and say, okay, well, that means I need 1 million people or 1 million like views to run this experiment thoroughly. And so that's really been dictating, that's really what those thresholds dictate that sample size. Yes?
You referred to user research a couple times.
Yep.
I'm just curious what methods you use and what you found most effective and cost-effective.
Yeah. So I think I can talk both about, so the question was around what are some of the user research or user sort of tools, user insights tools that we've used at Dropbox. So I'll go from, I think, most off the shelf to, I guess, most rigorous. The most off the shelf is just user testing, usertesting.com. And that's pretty quick. You can just set up a test really quickly, and you don't even have to show them like a functioning product. You can just show them like a mock that you made in InVision and give some instructions and say, hey, pretend you're on a website. Like this is actually a PDF. And tell me what you think. And that's sort of the most off the shelf that I've seen. User Zoom is a little more thorough. I think it does a more, my sense is that it seems to do a better job of sort of user, like filtering for the right users. So I think with user testing, you could, because I think if you run a test on like 3 users, they might be completely different users and your signal just might be way off. But with User Zoom, I think they do a better job of like helping you say, okay, this is the type of user that would probably be in this situation, so help me sort of find that user. I think it's because user testing sort of is a bit, like in user testing for Dropbox, if I said, I want only Dropbox users to run to be in this test, user testing might just say, hey, do you use Dropbox? And the person might say yes, but actually not be a user. And I think User Zoom is a little more thorough. The last one, which is super resource heavy, I mean, Dropbox can do this now, but is we actually have a separate user insights team. And they ask questions I just don't, there's brilliant questions, but they'll actually invite users to Dropbox and have like a 1-hour interview with them and really like dig deeply. I mean, that of course is really user intensive, but we've done that. We also will, for some times, like when I was in Dublin, we actually had these sort of quick user meetups in cities where people would come and then we would ask them questions and fill out surveys as well. That was a little more thorough, more time consuming, but it allows us to get insight-specific types of users, right? I think at that time we were considering language launches in like Dutch and Swedish, and it was important to get kind of that feedback. Yes?
So my question is about trust, user trust.
Yeah.
So you got to Dropbox, you mentioned it was already, whatever, 80 million accounts.
Yep.
You figure that probably the early adopters already included it.
Yeah.
On the pro side, at this point, probably having a small business trust you with their documents, with their tax returns, all information.
Right.
It's quite critical. Could you comment as to maybe some of the experiments that you ran to help increase the trust that potential customers would feel with your company?
Yeah. That's so the question was about what are some of the experiments that we've run to increase user trust. I'm actually going to answer it 2 ways. So the first way I'm going to answer it is what experiments we didn't run because we didn't want to break the trust we'd already built with users. And that was my point about knowing your speed limits, right? There are certain surface areas on Dropbox that we felt were comfortable like running experiments, maybe because they were just landing pages and we were communicating Dropbox a certain way, and that, you know, whether they interpreted it one way or the other was not as drastic, versus say, I want to run an experiment on like the core Dropbox experience. And if that doesn't work out, then that actually risks really confusing some users who've really used Dropbox, who use Dropbox and are really engaged. So one part of it was just, you know, there's some experiment ideas that we had that were like, no, we can't do this, right? Or this is just like a service area we're not going to touch, and that's just the decision that we make as a company. So some other experiments that we use as that we've done to talk about trust. I mean, one that I think is interesting is really just being more explicit about it. Like, you know, we like Dropbox has a lot of, you know, for example, Dropbox has a lot of the security compliances that we need to be able to sell into the enterprise, right? And sometimes it's just like a matter of, oh, as a user, as a lead, I'm not aware of that. And so sometimes we just ran copy experiments that said like, hey, like, keep your stuff safe with Dropbox. Like, here, learn more about, you know, if you want to check out our SOC 2 report or something like that. And that in and of itself was actually, I mean, I guess in that case, you're running an experiment against nothing, but being more explicit about some of those things we do as a company to like keep your trust. I don't know if that helps answer your question, or, but there was like specific copy experiments that we ran that were really effective. I actually, one side comment on copy experiments. So you remember I talked about like the cost benefit analysis of experiments. So you have all these experiments, you estimate their impact, and you want to prioritize them. Copy experiments are great experiments to run because the cost is super low, right? You're just changing some words. The benefit is incredibly high. Like, at least for Dropbox, I'm surprised by, you know, users read every word and they believe every word they read. And so, you know, experiments where we just changed a few words actually showed way more impact than like changing a complete layout or something like that. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. I was going to ask you, what daily and weekly processes do you and your team follow, you as an individual and with your team, to kind of keep track of your metrics, keep track of your goals?
Yeah, so I can talk about it on, probably not like a daily level, but on a weekly and then what we'll call a sprint level. So the way Dropbox works in terms of, you know, building new product or experiments is we go by a sprint process. So, and we have 8 sprints a year, which are roughly 6 weeks per sprint. So what we'll essentially say is, okay, at the beginning of a sprint, hey, we have planned out what we're going to do for the next 6 weeks. And on the product side, that might be, hey, we want to build this particular part of the feature and get it to like a certain phase. On the experiment side, we might say, hey, here's like a theme of experiments that we want to run in this sprint. And so then prior to that sprint, we'll actually lay out, this is the, you know, here are the experiments we want to run. And then we go through this process called tiling, which actually says, okay, this week we want to focus on this experiment, that experiment, and so forth. And that's really how we plan out the sprint. And then on a weekly basis, there's, I guess everybody has their own terminology, Scrum, Huddle, et cetera, where you actually meet, and usually there's sort of this like rubric of like, okay, what are the numbers? What are the experiments that we can turn off? What are the experiments that we should turn on? Are they ready to build? There's just basically this checklist of experiments to start and stop, and then like the insights of those experiments. So, and that's usually, we have a weekly sort of cadence of that. A lot of, I think, growth, actually I think it varies from company to company, but I've witnessed a lot of like growth marketers have some like Scrum training or some other sort of like training with like agile project management. I guess it really helps because, you know, if you have a team with a developer and a designer and maybe somebody on product, and so you have this like huge cross-functional effort, it's good to sort of like have a very organized approach to that.
So you talked a lot about web-based experiments. Do you do experiments also in your mobile apps?
So I've done a few, but I'm probably not the best person to speak about it. I think there's some other people at Dropbox who do. The experiments I've run tend to be, well, really they're web, but they're mobile, but the app is actually accessing a page on the web that's mobile optimized. So that doesn't really count. Those are tricky, I think, for two reasons. One is you actually have to get those into the builds, which is like a difficult process, right? Like the web, you can like change, you can make a push to production and it like happens. But if you're doing the change to a desktop client or a mobile client, it's not like every day you can roll out a new build and then someone has to download that build. So that's a little trickier. And then the other one is, the other thing is, I think some of the, at least as far as I know, some of the tracking tools that you might want to introduce into the app, you run the risk of just bloating the app, right? And then the performance is just degraded. So it's hard, like I personally don't have that much experience with mobile A/B testing. My sense for it is that like the threshold just for potential has to be higher, right? Like you can't, like, cause you're putting a lot at stake here. Given the fact that you have to like wait for, you can only release builds at a certain cadence, and if you're going to add in the right tracking, it's going to like bloat the app. So
I just want to thank you for coming to talk. Thank you. So first of all, thank you for coming to our event. Our next event is going to be a demo day. So if you have friends who have startups or products they want to kind of pitch, please. Oh wait, I know. I'll get into that. Please tell them to visit Refresh. We'll include you all in the newsletter, so you'll start receiving that information soon. We do have a workshop on Saturday. It's from 9 a.m. to 12. Breakfast is included. It's more of a hands-on workshop. The details are online. We have, I think, 3 or 4 more seats available. So if you're interested in coming, please RSVP, and thanks again. Thank you for coming.